Hello folks, in this guide we are covering absolutely everything you'll need to know during your first hours playing Blades of Fire. There are a range of minor spoilers regarding weapons, enemy types and treasures all located within mostly the first area of the game. Nothing story related, but you have at least been warned. We're covering absolutely everything in the following order, which would be combat, enemies, weapons, forging, exploration, and then a final summary section at the end. This guide is heavily timestamped, so do feel free to skip forward to whatever you need, but otherwise, let's get started. Okay, so starting off, we're going to be covering the ins and outs of combat. First off, we have the usual dodging, guarding, and parrying mechanics. Dodging works both side to side and backwards and forwards, whilst double tapping the button will have you dodge roll for significantly more distance. Holding the guard button down will cause you to block all incoming attacks, and timing a guard at just the right moment will initiate a parry, causing them to briefly be staggered and open for a counter-attack. Additionally, all stamina is replenished when performing a successful parry, and the counter-attack itself will not consume any additional stamina. Aside from parrying, one of the more interesting mechanics here is the fact that stamina replenishes whilst holding guard. Once holding guard for roughly a second or so, stamina will quickly begin to replenish, meaning you'll want to be using guard to replenish stamina mid-combat. Another important thing to note here is you will still receive damage whilst guarding incoming attacks. Depending on the weapon and type of attack, these may even penetrate through your guard and knock you off balance. As for parrying, typically the timing can be tricky, but some weapons have better parry windows than others, and this can largely be dictated when forging weapons. In regards to combat's deeper mechanics, I am working on a handful of more fleshed out guides that should be out within the very near future, so do stay tuned. As a few additional side notes, health can obviously be recovered using these green potions. However, if you do have damage fauna toggled on within the settings, then you can also try killing the local fauna, as doing so will replenish very small amounts of health, but this can be more hassle than it's worth. And of course, if it wasn't already obvious, stamina is consumed by most actions like attacking or dodging. However, guarding and sprinting do not consume stamina. Additionally, stamina will be consumed less if fighting enemies from a higher position than themselves, and stamina will be consumed more if fighting enemies from a lower position to themselves. Also, chaining into any quick attacks will take advantage of your momentum and thus consume less stamina. In regards to the actual combat itself, you will have 3 different attack styles to choose from. We have piercing, slashing, and blunt. Many weapons can switch between piercing and slashing, and typically, blunt weapons are just blunt. Depending on the enemy and its armor type, you will want to cycle through your weapons for the most appropriate fit. To assist with this, once locking onto any enemy, they will have an outline to represent your current weapon's effectiveness. Green means max damage, orange means the enemy's armor will absorb some damage, and red means attacks will literally bounce off without causing any damage at all. Of course, having a variety of different weapons is heavily advised, so you are always able to either switch weapons or stance to whatever is best suited for the occasion. Some enemies will not have a single coloured outline and instead will have a variation. This is where directional attacks come into play. We have 4 main attack buttons available and each one represents a different direction. For controllers, X/square or B/circle are left and right attacks respectively. Y or triangle is an overhead forward attack, whereas A or X is a low forward attack instead. These all have various different speeds, ranges and animations depending on weapon type, so familiarity with these weapons will be key to mastering their attack patterns. We can also hold down the attack button to charge any of these attacks. Some of these are able to break enemy guard and even sever larger enemy limbs, which is something we'll be covering later on. Of course, during combat, you will decrease the overall durability of your weapons, and thus they will weaken and become less effective over time. There are different types of maintenance we need to consider with most weapons, which would be durability and condition. Durability is simple. Your weapon has an overall amount. Attacking, blocking, etc. will decrease your durability, and after hitting either 0 or at any point below 100 durability, your weapon can break and thus become ineffective. Each weapon has a max number of repairs available, represented by this star icon right here, which we'll cover more a little bit later on. Additionally, you can spend a small amount of materials to repair a weapon at any anvil, which basically act as resting points, which we'll cover more later on also. Condition, however, is a more frequent stat to consider during combat, as this will directly affect the damage and effectiveness of your weapon over time. Some weapons do not have condition, and typically these are all exclusively the blunt weapons. The piercing and slashing weapons do, however, and we can see that the tip represents piercing and the body represents slashing. Using either stance will slowly deplete that part of the weapon, and the only way to repair this outside of repairing the entire weapon is to sharpen it instead, which can be done by holding down left on the D-pad. Doing so will deplete a chunk of the weapon's current durability, so do bear this in mind when forging and sharpening weapons. A few additional side notes for combat would be, backstabbing is a thing. You can't necessarily sneak, but if you are able to attack enemies from behind, then you will gain a damage bonus to the first strike. Additionally, mutilation is also a thing. Simply hold down any of the attack buttons other than A/X whilst using a weapon that surpasses the enemy's armor, and you will take them out in stylistic fashion. Overall, the combat has a huge focus on preparation and adaptability, so you'll want an array of different weapons for different purposes, and you'll want to ensure they have plenty of durability for whatever journey you're about to take them on. You will need to familiarize yourself with all of this game's combat mechanics, as not all of them will work on all enemies, and you'll need the entire kit to constantly adapt as you go. Up next, we have the different enemy types and how we can best combat and research them. We do have a healthy array of over 50 different enemy types within Blades of Fire, ranging from humanoids, undead, gremlins, trolls, elementals, and more, each with unique attack patterns, armor, and vulnerabilities. Typically, familiarity will be key to discovering each enemy's strengths and weaknesses, beyond smaller enemies typically being fast and larger enemies hitting quite hard. They do utilize other techniques such as invisibility, submerging, leaping, area of effects, and more. The best tool you have outside of your weapons would be the Bestiary located within Adso's Chronicles. In here, you will find tons of information for each individual enemy type, and as you progressively eliminate more and more of the same enemy type, you will unlock more information and progress Adso's illustrations until eventually completing them. Of course, unlocking additional segments will reveal additional info and tips to fight each enemy type, so you are heavily advised to check in on the Bestiary quite often. In regards to the individual enemies themselves, most enemies will respawn upon either dying and respawning yourself, or resting at any available anvil. Other enemies, such as elite enemies or mini-bosses, will not respawn upon resting. To discover which is which, you may need to revisit locations, as some of the more uncommon enemies do have respawn locations. As a quick side note, some enemies have unique mechanics, such as the troll is able to petrify itself, thus recovering its health and making itself invulnerable whilst doing so. In order to counter this, you will need to sever its limbs and then deplete its health bar before it is able to petrify itself. Much more can be read about this within the Bestiary, and you are advised to use the Bestiary in similar fashion with the other enemy types. There's not much else to discuss about enemies, at least not without diving into each individual one, and I'd much rather save that for a different video entirely. So, coming up next, we have all 7 weapon types and everything we need to know about them. We have daggers, sabers, swords, greatswords, twin blade arms, pole arms, and spears. Each weapon type comes with 5 different forging options, which can be unlocked by first acquiring forged scrolls. These are discovered upon defeating their respective enemy type for the first time. Once discovering the forged scroll, you will have to defeat the respective amount of enemies in order to unlock it within the forge. Additionally, each individual weapon has a set amount of upgrade parts that can be acquired on your journey. These are unlocked by presenting the corresponding weapon to the Seneschal statues scattered around the game, which is something we'll be covering a little bit later on. You can see the available upgrades via the icons below each weapon, and hovering over the weapon from the Forge Scroll screen will show its name, styles, material cost, and its minimum and maximum range. And as a final note, holding down either X or square will show a rough outline of each weapon type's inherent strengths and weaknesses. Now onto the actual weapon stats themselves. Starting off, we have damage right at the very top. Piercing and slashing weapon damage is based off of its current sharpness. This will degrade with each attack and can be replenished by either sharpening that part of the weapon or repairing the weapon entirely. Next, we have momentum. This is basically added unmodified damage and is also used to break enemy blocks. This is the main damage stat for blunt weapons, as they do not need to be sharpened and thus only degrade in durability. Heavier materials and long reach weapons will also increase your weapon's momentum. Penetration is needed for piercing and slashing weapons to bypass armor, otherwise attacks will be stopped. Penetration is also dictated by sharpness, so typically the sharper your weapon, the better that weapon's armor penetration will be. As a few side notes for each fighting style, piercing style attacks can be stopped or partially absorbed by enemy armor, but they do have bonus penetration. Slashing style attacks can also be stopped or absorbed entirely by enemy armor, but they either deal more damage or cover a wider area. And then blunt style damage is stopped or absorbed depending on enemy size instead of its armor rating. Next, we have durability and sharpening cost. Durability is obviously the overall amount of health your weapon has. Your weapon can break once it is below 100 durability, and of course, you only have a maximum amount of repairs per weapon before it breaks forever. Sharpening cost is quite simple. This dictates how much of a weapon's durability is decreased every time the weapon is sharpened. Resharpening with moderation is key to good weapon maintenance, but not doing so before an important fight would be reckless. Block quite simply determines your ability to absorb enemy blows when guarding. This is in reference to the yellow bar that is displayed whenever guarding in-game. A higher block will grant a larger bar, and thus you'll be able to guard more attacks before your guard breaks. Next, we have the parry stat. High defense and short range weapons will improve your parry time window, thus making these weapons much more capable of pulling off consistent parries. Up next, we have stamina, and this is quite simply your overall stamina whilst using that weapon, meaning some weapons will offer more stamina than others. And then dodge cost is quite simply the amount of stamina consumed when dodging with that weapon. Finally, for the last 4 stats we have, reach is obviously how far and wide your weapon will reach when attacking. Weight affects a bunch of the stats that we've previously discussed, but its overall amount is shown right here. Balance doesn't have much info currently, but I would imagine it's the weapon's overall balance between offense and defense, as my more balanced weapons do seem to have a higher rating than the others. And finally, speed shows whether we can use the weapon to its full potential whilst at maximum stamina, which to be honest is a little bit of a cryptic description. Overall, you'll want a range of weapons that specialize in different stats, having something long and heavy for the bigger enemies, whilst having something small and defensive to parry with, and possibly something long and sharp for tight encounters are just a few of the options available. You will not be able to rely on just one weapon type, so understanding weapon stats and what works best will be important for success. Moving on, we're going to cover everything we could need to know about forging. First off, we have the Sacred Steel Tree. The steel ingots here are broken into 4 different levels. We have Primordial at the center, Noble is this deep orange, Arcane is the lighter toned orange, and Epic is yellow. Each point of the triangle represents a different property. We have Laceration at the top, Defense on the left, and Durability on the right, meaning the closer the ingots get to either of these 3 points, the more their inherent stats will align with those properties. Additionally, we do have a small row of available timbers at the bottom that follow the same 4 levels from before, but only range from defense to durability instead. The easiest way to cover the vast majority of forging is to simply get into it ourselves, so we're going to take this greatsword template and start picking it apart. Starting from the top, the weapon's length will always cost a set amount of iron, and this is shown right here. Next, we need to decide on the specific materials for the point, edge, and blade itself. By default, the primordial options cost no additional materials, but the noble, arcane, and epic options all do, and they also require higher forge temperatures, which we will cover right now. So, taking the sovereign steel ingot for example, if we wanted to use this for our point, we would gain the following green stats. The numbers in red simply show what we lose when changing from the currently selected ingot right here. If we were to choose Sovereign Steel for our tip, it shows it would cost us 30 petrified tips right here, and the forge would have to be at a temperature of at least 600. This would be done automatically for us when forging the weapon. It costs coal to heat the forge, and the cost is shown right here. And naturally, the higher the level of ingot used, then the higher the forge temperature will need to be. Now moving on to the edge of the weapon, if we were to select the Indomitable Steel ingot right here, then this would cost us 15 accursed flesh and 15 amber. This would not require any additional cost for coal, as the temperature already meets the same requirements as our other ingots chosen. We're choosing Indomitable Steel for our blade also, and again, this doesn't increase the coal cost, as we are already using 10 coal to meet the 600 needed. Next, we have our cross-section option. These cost no additional materials, but naturally still impact the weapon, so choose whatever is best for you. Next, we have the guard and pommel, and very similar to how we designed the blade, we simply decide on the size of the guard and pommel we would like, and then decide on each of their ingots, depending entirely on whatever stats we would like. So upon finally deciding and holding down the forge prompt at the bottom, you'll be presented with a final materials cost screen. This shows your individual costs against your total amounts. As we can see, this forge costs 10 coal to heat the forge itself, iron due to the size of blade, guard, and pommel chosen, and then we have various other materials used due to our selection of ingots. I really hope this has helped simplify the materials, in that coal is really only used to heat the forge, iron and wood is exclusively used for the size of weapon parts, and then materials are used to forge different steel ingots. Next, we have the actual process of forging the weapon itself. Before we start here, I just want to say this. If you've already completed a forge on the exact same weapon type already, then you can use forge memory to automatically acquire the rating that you last acquired when manually hammering that weapon type. So, even if you're not much of a fan of the hammering minigame, if you're able to acquire a solid rating for a weapon type, then you theoretically won't have to hammer it again, at least for quite some time. As for your first time, however, you will need to take part in the minigame here, but it is not terribly complicated once you understand the different strategies. I am working on a full forging guide, so keep an eye out for that in the very near future. But for now, let's cover the essential mechanics. Hammering your weapon will only affect its maximum amount of repairs, represented with this star icon right here. So naturally, we do want as many as possible, so weapons can be used longer before they inevitably break. To do this, we simply want to match these columns to the white line shown on screen. The hammer mechanics are quite simple. We can change position, we can adjust strength so as to hit with more or less impact, we can adjust strike width so as to affect a smaller or larger surface area, and we can adjust strike angle so as to angle the impact in different directions. You will need to adjust between all of these mechanics in order to make sure as many of the columns are as close to the white line as possible. As an example, and for this particular layout, a solid strategy is to start from the far left and push the bars down as we go, something like a wave motion. Starting off here, we can see the impact area, so we're going to adjust the strength until we've maxed it out. And now you can see that the impact will be greater. To change this further, we're going to adjust the width. We're maxing this out also, and as you can see, this has now brought a lot of the first few columns down, close to the white line, but further down the line, we have raised bars even more. Not to worry, however, this is absolutely fine. Next, we're going to adjust our angle in the direction we intend to move. This will slightly change the overall length of the impact and slightly adjust some of the taller columns. This is where things can get fiddly. We're going to slightly adjust our strength again so as to match these 2 or 3 columns as best as we can, just like this. Then, when ready, we can go ahead and hammer the blade for the first time. As you can see, if we quite simply move down the blade, we can see the columns begin to line up quite well. So we're going to pick an appropriate position and then decide to hammer again. Just as a quick side note, the maximum amount of hammer attempts are shown right here. You will always have to make slight adjustments as you make your way down the blade, and this is one of the more simpler examples to show, but I feel this has done the job on giving a simple explanation as to what you are actually trying to achieve and how best to do so. Upon reaching max stars, you will be prompted and then can finalize the weapon. If you fail to reach max stars and are looking low on available hammer strikes, then I advise considering getting as high as you can and then manually finalizing the weapon, as exceeding too many strikes will break the weapon entirely and you will have lost materials and time. As I said before, I'll have a much deeper guide coming out very shortly, so do keep an eye out for this thumbnail. Otherwise, I do hope that has helped simplify forging for you folks. For the final part of this guide, we have exploration. Now, there's a fair bit to cover here, so I'll simplify it all as best as possible. In regards to the main quest, it's rather vague, but in a very good way, forcing you to uncover clues and use your wits in order to progress. This, of course, means that the story will slowly unravel itself also, which plays in nicely with the overall theme of exploration and progress. We do have a world map that gives relatively decent info on specific regions too. The map will mark main locations such as anvils, Seneschal statues and runes. Additionally, you can place up to 5 custom markers to mark locations for any reason, and these can all be seen from your compass in-game. Fast traveling can be done between different anvils to make exploration much more convenient. Adso is also more than just a non-combatant companion, in which you can speak with him directly or indirectly to prompt hints, context, or even just general chit-chat. You'll need to combine clues found within the world, Adso's insights, and your own wits in order to solve many of the puzzles and secrets littered throughout your adventures, so keeping your eyes peeled and communicating often with Adso is heavily advised. Now, in regards to treasures, 2 of the main treasures you'll be looking for are health and stamina gems. These are automatically slotted into either your Aegis of life or stamina, and upon collecting 4 of each, the Aegis will grant you either maximum health or stamina respectively. These seem to only be located inside of chests that you'll hopefully stumble upon within your travels. As an example, it would appear that the game's first area, named Bestiary Hamlet, does have 8 chests in total, thus rewarding 4 of each stone, and I would imagine that all other regions will behave in a similar fashion. We also have Forge Criptex, not to be confused with Forge Scrolls. Forge Criptex are unique scrolls that increase the inherent star value of respective weapons, and upon activating one of these, you will increase that weapon type's max star count by 1. This is how I am able to have great swords and spears with a max star count of 5. It would appear that the first layer is for 2 types of weapons, and the outer layer is just for 1 type of weapon, meaning each weapon type's max stars can be increased by 3 via the Forge Criptex menu. Moving on to Seneschal statues, and these are basically statues that you'll find scattered throughout your journeys. Interact with the statue whilst holding the corresponding weapon, and you will be rewarded with additional parts for that weapon that can now be used when forging. It is really as simple as that. Conveniently enough, these are also marked once discovered, meaning remembering and returning to them isn't too inconvenient. In regards to materials, you'll typically find iron, timber, and coal inside any of the many breakables found littered throughout the game. These all respawn and seem to generate random materials. Breaking these objects does not deplete weapon durability, but accidentally connecting with anything that isn't breakable will deplete a decent chunk of durability, so do try to use positioning and specific attacks to try and break these objects. For the rarer materials, these are mostly found when defeating enemies, and their drop chances do seem to be somewhat random. We can track these materials to some extent within Adso's Chronicles, where once we have acquired the relevant information, we can see specific locations where materials are mostly found, making farming them much more convenient. Finally, upon dying within Blades of Fire for any reason, you will respawn at the last visited anvil, and the weapon in which you died with will be left wherever you last died. Similar to other Souls-likes, but more forgiving, as the weapon will remain there indefinitely until you eventually return and pick it back up, meaning you don't need to rush back to where you just died unless you really want that weapon back. There's a huge focus on returning to areas to progress or discover previously inaccessible secrets. The map helps with this endeavour massively, whilst not entirely taking away any of the initial wonder when exploring. Paths are linear, but nooks and crannies are plentiful, and there are secret treasures to be found everywhere. It strikes a solid blend between keeping you on the rails, but also giving you large areas to explore at your own pace. All in all, exploration is done quite well, and you are encouraged to keep your eyes open and your wits ever present. In summary, folks, there's a large focus on forging, weapon maintenance, and combat within Blades of Fire. Exploration plays an important role, as it will be required for maximum health and stamina, as well as locating additional weapon pieces and other treasures along the way. The core gameplay loop is forge weapons, go and complete areas of the map, repair weapons until needing to forge more, etc. Whether you forge little and often, or choose to forge all 4 equipped weapons at once, part of the fun to be had here is approaching the maintenance side of gameplay in your own way. This game doesn't force any particular approach, which is nice, and despite a minigame being tied into the forging process, it isn't too complicated to pick up or begin getting quite good at. I feel the biggest appeal will be the combat and how all weapons play a different role. We have of course touched on an awful lot within this guide, all of the basics and a lot of the more deeper, less explained mechanics. As mentioned before, I'm working on a forging guide and a combat guide, and I will be working on more guides in the future, possibly going into best weapon designs, etc. But anyway, that is it for this video, folks. I do have a range of guides and news videos on the channel, so do feel free to stop on by and check things out. Otherwise, thanks for watching, folks, and until next time, peace.